think about the different types of questions people ask ChatGPT and the different like sentiments in them. There's sort of a sense in which if you try to write down some mathematical definition of fairness and like enforce it in the model, you will inevitably cause some externality to someone else who makes a query and it gives them the wrong answer.
Before we start this podcast, this episode is sponsored by Zeta Markets. So if you want to trade perps without giving your coins to centralized exchanges, Zeta gives you all the benefits of your favorite exchange with self-custody and transparency. Trade perps with leverage, backed by Solana, speed, scalability, and almost no gas fees. The link is in the description. Let's get back to the video. Hi Tarun, welcome to the Gajesh show. How's it going?
Pretty good. Can't complain. 2023 seems a lot longer than 2022, so that's a good thing.
Awesome. Diving straight to the first question. What is your origin story?
I studied math and theoretical physics in college. I was going to do a PhD in theoretical physics. And then I got convinced to do this kind of, to work at this company that was like building ASICs, like special purpose hardware for doing physics simulations. And, what we were doing sort of like computational drug discovery using these simulations. So I went and did that. And then I was like, I'll go back and do my PhD. And then I never did that. So then somehow I've never quite gone back, even though, hey, maybe someday soon retire into being a PhD or something. I worked on doing sort of some low-level programming for a long time, so like embedded systems. So like we built custom chips. How do you build an interpreter? How do you build an operating system? How do you dispatch code? I also worked on studying, using those simulations to simulate sort of some different condensed matter physics stuff. When I was working in that field, that was sort of the first time I heard about crypto, because in 2011, we were taping out a chip. And so, at that time, there was not many people building custom hardware, but somehow our supplier just like ghosted us for 6 months after we gave them $25 million. And then they came back and they were like, sorry, we'll give you a 10% discount. And they delayed our project by like a lot. Delays in hardware projects are much more expensive than delays in software because, as you can imagine, because like you have to there's just like way more planning you have to do to actually like get time to print out the chips. There's a higher error rate, so you always have to do many rounds of like correcting your hardware. And so like it's very expensive to have a hardware delay. Software delays I feel like are a lot cheaper. So we were just like you delayed us for and cost us a lot of money. You have to tell us at least like why you did that. And so that was when they're like, oh, well, this Bitcoin thing, people want to make hardware miners. They like paid some money to basically do MEV, and like they got in front of us. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe I should start mining this Bitcoin thing. And so, yeah, I mined a bunch, but then I sold it all, because I was a dummy. And that was how I first started kind of like being interested in crypto. And then but I'd kind of still been of this belief that like there was something that didn't quite make sense about crypto. So I'd worked at this place where we were building these distributed systems for doing these simulations. So we were very cognizant of what it takes to build a data center. Like we ran 2 or 3 data centers. We had like 10,000 GPUs, like stuff like that. So like one thing that if you talk to people who worked in distributed systems, especially older people who work in distributed systems, is that there's this theorem called the CAP theorem. And the CAP theorem sort of says you can't, all these like trilemmas you hear about in blockchains come from the CAP theorem, because the CAP theorem sort of says there's 3 properties you want out of a database. One is consistency. So if I submit a transaction, it stays in there. One is availability, but I can keep submitting new transactions to the database. And the last one is partition resistance. Like if the network splits because like the network goes out and then the network restarts, it can synchronize itself. And the CAP theorem says you only get 2 out of 3 of those. Now, Bitcoin was sort of like advertising itself as getting around the CAP theorem. Like you got all 3 in some sense, which seemed impossible. It turned out that you could get around it under a different security model, which is sort of the security model of blockchain. So I think once people started formalizing that, then I started to be like, I was probably the first one of my colleagues to be like, okay, actually there is something very real here. It's just like, it's actually quite difficult to explain. So it's not obvious why it should work at all. It happens to work, but it doesn't have a very easy explanation for why. And that just led me down this rabbit hole. And I was working in high frequency trading after that, but like was just kind of like analyzing all these papers, trying to write code to break people's node software, stuff like that. Especially at the time, like people were kind of had very weird consensus mechanisms, and you could try to DDoS them or flood them or cause different types of issues. So I was just sort of doing that for fun.
Yeah, that's really a great story, and this is one of I think the most unique stories I've heard in crypto. So my next question is like, how was your student life at Cornell?
At Cornell, I was just like, I had done a lot more programming when I was in high school and middle school and like programming contests and stuff like that. But then when I went to college, I was like, programming is like too, maybe simple is not the right word, but it's kind of like you don't really learn any deep facts about things as much as you learn how to put things together. And I was just like, oh, like if you can't like formalize it, then you'll never really understand the thing. You're just kind of like a button pusher. So I spent all my college not doing any programming or CS stuff, and I really focused on just like pure math. And like I'm trying to understand doing, algebraic geometry, things like that.
Awesome. What was your love story with math?
I think it's more that like there's sort of a type of aesthetic beauty to pure math when it's done in a certain way, where you can like take some very complicated system, reduce it to some very simple sets of rules, and then use those rules to get some kind of very surprising but general result. And I think the difference is math versus like engineering fields. Engineering fields are sort of like there's point A and there's point B, and there's a few paths. Which one is the best one to take? Math is more like here's point A, here's point B. What does the set of all paths possible even look like? And what's the set of all ways you could define what the best paths are? Which is sort of a superset of each engineering field, right? Like the paths from A to B for a biologist might be hack together some R code and like get a plot. The path to A from A to B for a CS person might be, hey, we need to actually make this so that we can do this 500,000 times. So we need to make the code like very compact, modular, understandable, whatever, right? And maybe, like a chemist, the path to A to B might be like, hey, we just do the experiment and it works or it doesn't. Right? Those are all three very different things, but they might end up being the same A and B. And mathematicians are like, what's the set of all A and B paths you can take between A and B? And there's some sense in which proving things about the whole universe feels like much more powerful than just like knowing one of the paths. And that to me is sort of why I think math is very pretty.
Gotcha. What is your best and your worst decision in your career?
I probably could have left trading earlier. I don't know if I was like learning that much more. I mean, I think the best decision was to not go to academia and not do a PhD because like, both my parents did a PhD. I'm going to be the only non-PhD in my family very soon because my brother is in grad school. And so there's like inevitably, I mean, as you know, as an Indian person, like there's always pressure to do those types of things.
Yep.
I think it took a while for me to convince my parents I wouldn't be homeless and on the street if I didn't go. I don't know. It's like their mentality. I think that was definitely the best. I guess the worst probably, was like I could have left trading earlier, honestly. Or I could have maybe left doing what I was doing earlier, but honestly, I've just been lucky and things have worked out so far. So I'm not super. I definitely knock on wood. I think things went reasonably well. So nothing super crazy.
So how was your life as a researcher?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a funny thing, right? I'm like, I run a company, but somehow doing research is like good for my company in some ways. And so I kind of backed myself into the following thing, which is if I look at places that do research that impacts people in practice, it's like oftentimes not done in academia. It's done, at least for CS, it seems to be done at like places like DeepMind, places like Fair, and at startups that care about research like OpenAI. And so one of the tenets I have when I started my company was like, how do you do that in crypto, but also have a business model versus like something like OpenAI or DeepMind, they're always going to have this problem where like neither of them intrinsically have a business model and they're sustainable, and they need to be kind of like controlled by Google or Microsoft in the case of OpenAI now, because otherwise they can't really like figure out how to afford to do things. And I think the interesting thing about crypto is you can actually build business models where research can be first, but it's also sustainable. And so I guess that was sort of part that started sort of this journey. But I think when I think about research, a lot of times my philosophy is crypto is filled with a lot of shit historically where people don't know why it worked. The fact that you have this freedom to write whatever code you want, no matter how shitty or awesome it is, means that people will just like write something, put it out there, and then people will be gamblers and put money into it or not. And so the interesting thing, and this goes back to some of my earliest papers in crypto, are observing when there's something that seems to be working in spite of it absolutely not at all in some ways having any real reason it should work, and then trying to use that as sort of empirical evidence, almost like a scientist, where you're like, okay, I did this experiment and I got a result I don't expect, so now I need to come up with some theory that can explain why this works. The difference is in crypto, it's like the market does something, you see something happen, then you make a theory, then you try to see if the theory works, and then people take that theory, then they make a new thing, and then that new thing has some unexpected property, and then it's a little bit more like the type of research style is sort of a little bit like trading or economics research, where it's like the market environment does something, you observe it, and then you come up with a theory. But it's also sort of a little bit like science in that each theory you come up with influences what people build. And so it's sort of like halfway in between those two modalities. So a lot of it is definitely observing what works empirically, but then a lot of it is also trying to come up with things that people can build that improve the existing mechanisms, and then having some math that can describe that. And once you have the math that can describe that, then you can work and find algorithms that people can use for implementing those.
Awesome. So how was your life at D Shaw as a trader?
That was great. It was like the best. It was like doing a PhD, except I had no pressure. Like you got a lot more than a grad student. You were just doing like research and writing research papers. And it was a very collegial environment. It was like, I don't know. There were definitely days I just like hung out with people and we just talked about random papers and didn't do any like real work. And then there were days where it was like, yeah, we do a lot of like programming stuff. And it was like honestly the best environment in my mind. I don't know how else to say. I have a lot of respect for David.
So it's like crypto people hanging out on Twitter and considering it as work.
No, it was more academic than that. Like it was like I think crypto people hang on Twitter and say a lot of sometimes. This was like more reasonable. But I think it was more like you didn't have a lot of like very, very direct pressure in the same way that I think you do startup, where like you have to come up with new ideas, but you also don't have time to like let them ruminate and like you improve them. You're just like, new idea, shit it out. New idea, shit it out. And then in big companies, it's like no one lets you like do something that doesn't match the exact schematic of like what you're supposed to do, right? But the nice thing about having a billionaire pay for everything is that, and like themselves be a researcher, is that there's not like this huge amount of crazy pressure. So it's a little bit more like being a postdoc or a grad student, because you can take your time, but you also are funded well enough. So that was kind of cool. I definitely like learned a lot more about computer science in ways I hadn't learned. And I felt like I got a lot more of an education there than I did. And that's sort of what made me not go back to grad school in the fields I thought I would do, in physics or math or statistics. Partially because I did like the idea that like something real could come out of your research versus like, it's purely theoretical. And then I just kind of was like, okay, what things are actually real? And so actually, and maybe this is actually my bigger regret, possibly. It's unclear if it's true. But, a lot of my friends from where I was working went to DeepMind and Facebook AI research really early. So like one of my really good friends and colleagues, Adam Lehrer, he was like the third or fourth employee at Facebook AI research. He's on the PyTorch paper. He like had a ton of like success, and a lot like at that time, all these people were trying to hire people from D Shaw for this stuff. My first boss at D Shaw is the head of DeepMind's like bio research.
Wow.
He's like first author on the AlphaFold paper. So like the alumni of that place are crazy. That's all I have to say. Kevin Bowers from Jump, like there's a lot of people who were there. It was a very small place, but like people seem to have done cool things after. So a lot of people left for that, and I was like, I don't believe in the AI stuff right now. And I was like, I'll go to trading because like there you make a math model and then you have to put it in production and you have to see if it works, and if it doesn't work, you can't bullshit your way through it. And yeah, maybe I should have possibly done more of that stuff. But that, I think, like philosophically, I'm much more aligned with crypto than AI. I'm certainly not. I would not put myself in the maxi of any form. I definitely believe in like data privacy rights, just like privacy rights in general. And I don't think that AI can ever give that to people. It's sort of like this, like the most centralizing force that exists, and you need something to counterbalance that. And, I guess we're all hoping that's crypto, but yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends who are in AI. I don't know. It definitely is interesting because it's definitely reached the point of being a rat race. Like I think in 2012 through 2016, you got to write some of the earliest research papers, and you could kind of like people started just implementing your algorithms or implementing your research, and like you're off to the races. Now it's like there's like this like army of like 100,000 researchers like all competing over like I improved the model by 5%. And it's like, yeah, every once in a while there'll be like a step function, like the attention is all you need paper. But most of the time it's like these tiny incremental updates. And it's a little bit of a rat race. And I think an interesting thing about crypto is it still hasn't turned into that. But I feel like it's kind of due for that in both in the type of research I do, like MEV and DeFi, as well as in ZK. I think like those two fields will kind of end up having a cycle that looks like AI, where like in 5 years we'll look back and be like, people will like have a totally different respect for the research then.
So what was the birth story of Gauntlet?
Yeah, so Gauntlet came from the following. So like I was working in high frequency trading, and I worked on designing our simulations where we managing the simulation engine, which is like this thing where you have a trading strategy which you define as like some model. The model takes in some data, constructs an output, and then executes it, and you kind of simulate how different actors in the system work, like how different exchanges behave, and like whether they're delayed or not. How does that cause whether your strategy works or not? Like if an exchange sends you a packet significantly later than you expect, does that mean that it doesn't work because you got front run and like someone got an execution in before you? Stuff, there's a lot of stuff, little details like that. But to actually tune your strategy, you have to simulate it because there's just too many moving variables, and you can't just like make a simple model that says like, oh, okay, like, yeah, if the latency goes up, do this. It's actually it's quite nuanced. It's like, oh, if it does it in this condition, then yes. If it doesn't do in this condition, then do this. Like, it's quite complicated decision tree. And it's much easier to fit that numerically than to do it exactly. And so one thing I'd observed was when I was reading all these papers in 2016 and 2017, in particular, the paper that really stood out to me was like the Algorand paper, was that like none of the assumptions in proof of stake protocols the financial assumptions were very clear, right? Everyone was like, oh, well, people will have this coin and they stake it, and that's the Sybil resistance mechanism. Well, what if the coin has no value? What if someone makes a derivative that convinces all the people who own the coin to unstake because they all want to buy the derivative asset? There's a whole universe of attacks that are not, people just didn't consider. They're just like, oh, like is the cryptography, does the VRF work correctly? And it's like, yes, this is quite important. But there's also the fact that moving to proof of stake from proof of work changes the financial type of asset you have. And so that changes your security, how you should think about the cost of security for the network. And so then I started just making simulations, writing a lot of software, and I found some sort of bugs in some early L1s in 2018. And people there were like, hey, do you want to work for us? And like, I don't know. I feel like all the people who raise money in ICOs always kind of sketched me out a little bit. And I was like, I don't know if I could work for you. But I'll do some contract work or consulting. And I was doing that. And then by like summer of 2018, like Libra was doing, like DM/Libra was doing a bunch of like acqui-hires, and they were like sort of trying to acqui-hire my one-person consultancy. And that was when I was like, okay, so people really care about this type of analysis of like this particular type of stress test. It's not totally clear what applications will use it other than proof of stake networks. But it's clear there's something, and I basically was like, hey, look, people want simulation software. They just don't know exactly how they want it delivered to them. And maybe it's worth taking a bet trying to figure out if you can productize this instead of just like selling out to someone. Then I raised money, and it's a very small amount of money actually. And I ran to my co-founder who worked on self-driving car simulations. So we had like people who had simulations of different complex systems where the simulation was crucial to it being used in production. So like self-driving cars, right? Like every car has 10 million to 1 billion times the number of miles driven in simulation for every real mile, right? And that's the way they stress test, like, oh, like a bird like flies into the windshield, do you brake or not? A person walks by it, how do you like react how you hit them? And so simulation is really crucial for self-driving cars because it's like you can't just get the average value correct, right? You actually care about the tails of the distribution. Like you can't kill someone, right?
Yes.
Right? Or like trading is the same way. Like the average value is easy to estimate, but the times where you jump to zero, where like all your money goes away, is very hard. And that's what these kind of simulation stuff is good for. So we were like, okay, we'll find a way for making that useful here. And DeFi didn't really exist then. And so once DeFi kind of started existing, that was sort of when we started writing papers on like, when I was saying these types of things where it's like, Uniswap, to a trader at that time, and I mean, people still fight about this on Twitter, so it should tell you. But it just sounded like a dumb idea. Like you're just going to get picked off all the time. You're like telling everyone the price, right? And yet it still was really popular and got used. And so that there was once that was there, it was like, okay, there's some empirical evidence that this thing works for a reason under some assumptions about the types of user. What are those assumptions? How do you stress test them? How do you choose the parameters? How do you choose the fees such that it's stable? And I think once DeFi opened up, that was when we're like, oh, actually, in the same way that you would never have a bank that says, this is the interest rate that I'll give you if you leave your money here, and this is the interest rate I'll lend to you, and they never change it. You're never going to have a DeFi protocol that like has an interest rate or a fee and it never changes it. It's like always going to have to change it with market conditions, with behaviors of other systems. And the only way to decide what to change it to is simulating all these scenarios and then saying like, okay, like this particular set of parameters optimizes some objective you have. And so then that was what we focused on. That's kind of the direction we've gone in. So that, long story short, or short story long, that's
So you recently launched Aera treasury management for DAOs. So what was what was the birth story of that?
Yeah, so when we were working with different protocols like Aave, one thing I had observed was that the insurance funds of all these protocols, a lot of them, their treasury is partially supposed to be an insurance fund, is kind of misallocated because a lending protocol is supposed to have its insurance fund sort of denominated in the assets it's lending out. Like if I'm a lending protocol and I'm lending out Sol, USD, and ETH, but my treasury is denominated only in Mango, let's say, then that will be bad because if the loans are defaulting in Sol, ETH, and USD, then the people who are depositing in the protocol, who are taking the Sol, ETH, and USD, they expect to get that back. And if there's ever kind of this bad feedback loop where they don't, then you run into all these problems where like the insurance fund doesn't work. It doesn't actually cover you at the time you need it. At exactly the time you have to pay out, the assets in there are not the assets you need, and so then you can't pay out. And so it became clear that a lot of DAOs that earn money from taking risk, so that's lending protocols, perpetual protocols, things like that, they actually need to do more treasury management. And the treasury management has to adjust to usage. So based on what loans people are taking out, based on what risk people are taking in the system, you need to adjust the insurance fund to match that. And so how do you do that in a decentralized way? Governance is too slow to do that, right? Because people are interacting with these protocols all the time. Governance will never be able to. So instead, one way of doing it in a credibly decentralized way is to make it more like a competition. So people are competing. They sort of have to stake to submit sort of a treasury construction, and then they get graded based on how well their construction covered the protocol's liabilities or whatever objective they have. And so the idea is it's sort of like a contest. It turns DAO treasury management into a contest instead of like people in forums saying like, hey, we should sell all our tokens. Like that never works. Like there's also this very bad incentive for treasury management in that people are voting with a DAO token to sell that DAO token. You're asking people to vote to lower the value of the asset they own. All right, like it's not. So you need to actually have a very objective way of doing it. And having a competition for it is in our view the objective of doing it. So that's sort of the birth story. But it's a very like, hey, we saw this need, and we're like, there's just so many assets in DAO treasuries that are like not being allocated to the thing they're supposed to, because governance is bad at allocating. So
Gotcha. So recently, today, there is a fight going on with Jump and A16Z, or like it's basically like Wormhole versus LayerZero, and Uniswap governance is finally really useful, and governance is useful. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think the thing about Uniswap governance is like in general, it's not so obvious what Uniswap needs governance for, if we're being totally honest, right? Like the protocol works despite governance existing, not because
Yeah.
governance. Compound and Aave are a very different circumstance, right? They have to change these parameters we were talking about. That's just fundamental to them, right? Like if the market is crashing and they don't update a risk factor, then the Mango exploit can happen to them much more easily. So governance actually serves as a form of risk management, insurance, etc. It's like extremely important. But for Uniswap, it doesn't matter. Like LPs don't, like nothing changes to them in some ways, unless governance tried to take some of their revenue, right? Like the only thing governance can do from the LP's perspective is worsen my revenue, which is not an ideal thing. I think the interesting thing is that Uniswap governance is very tied to the license that they use for Uniswap v3, right? Like why are all these governance votes getting contentious is like, a lot of them are over Uniswap governance, who technically owns the license to whether you can deploy Uniswap v3 in different contexts, approving for its usage. Now, let's take maybe like a 10-foot step back and think back to this in this context of open source software in general. Historically, open source software licenses were always just like, hey, you added a license after the fact, or like you're writing software and like everyone just told you, hey, cover your ass, put a license there, or like figure out what license to use, because otherwise someone will like sue you later because like some criminal used your open source library and they lost money and they want to sue someone. But the interesting thing about the DAO owned license is that the contributors to an open source project, in theory, get to vote on whether someone can use their license. And like that's really interesting. I mean, we've never really seen that in open source software before. People didn't like fight over like license rights as much as they were like license, no license, here's what it is, and that's it. Right? They never executed this like, hey, we'll give exemptions thing, and the exemptions are voted on by the community. And I think these things are very fraught with conflict, because inevitably everyone has some stake in something that would like to use the license of this. But arguably, in some ways, it's like a more fair version of open source software, because it actually allows the creator to have some sort of veto power, or creators, because it's never an individual, right? It's like really community. In this case, it's not clear that it is the community, that, like the creators as much, but there is a sense in which, just from a like epistemological point of view, that's like a big jump for open source software in my mind.
What do you think about the future of tokenomics, especially like in DeFi projects?
I mean, I think it's just going to mainly, I mean, DeFi, I think, was just going to turn into like revenue based, like it's just going to really be like a kind of tied to how much revenue you're earning. And like, if we're being honest, like the DeFi tokens actually do have pretty reasonable multiples right now relative to their revenue, which is like crazy, right? They look better than like all these shitty fintech startups, which is pretty impressive, right? So I don't think DeFi's tokenomics is going to be that interesting. I think all the stuff that existed last year at this time was mainly garbage and won't come back. And I'm not very positive on any of these VE token mechanisms, because they just seem like not they like. I don't think. I think the only people who want to lock up their token for 4 years to vote are the people who are voting, who are LPs who are voting on their own fees. So it's not like the incentives are very malaligned. But I think for layer ones, there might be some interesting stuff, depending on like how the fee structure changes. Like Solana doing kind of like the per contract hot and cold fees. Ethereum doing multi-dimensional EIP 1559. I think like I think we're going to have, instead of redesign of tokenomics per se. We're going to have more of a redesign of like how fee redistribution works and how fees get charged. And that's going to be a big part of the next cycle.
What do you think about regulated exchanges like Coinbase and like against like decentralized exchanges?
I think the hardest part is like onboarding. And one thing I will say of like the last cycle was NFTs were clearly the number one way people downloaded wallets that they ran themselves. And so like there's some sense in which NFTs sort of being like a way of getting people to actually download wallets. Like I remember there were all these TikTok videos of like how to
Yeah.
download MetaMask and change your RPC host, right? Like you never see someone do that to buy a coin. No one would care enough, right? And so there's sort of this interesting thing of like, how do you onboard users into decentralized finance?
So like right now ChatGPT is going viral and everyone is trying to build another AI app. Like people are switching from crypto to AI. Some people are building AI and crypto
All you have to do is
startups.
take the name of the shitcoin protocol and remove coin and add .ai.
Dot AI. Yes, agreed. So like, what are your thoughts on like, do you think is the like this is a movement where like in '90s like computers came and like some people like lost their jobs, but also in early '20s early 2000 like people got like programming jobs, and like what do you think about like the whole AI revolution right now?
So I'm really happy for my friends who are all, getting wealthy off it, I guess. I mean, in some cases, it sort of depends, but yeah, there's some people I've known for a decade who've been grinding on random startups whose startups have had a lot of success. So happy for them. But I think, you know, there was something I read recently which I thought was a good truism, which is like it's really easy to some extent for existing businesses to integrate AI, and it's really hard for existing businesses to integrate crypto. In some sense, that means crypto is always going to grow from like purely new things, whereas AI might not grow from that. It might grow from just like applying it to like old things. And so I would say like I believe there's some truth to this boom in the same way there was some truth to 2021 in crypto. But there's always, in every lie, in every good lie, there's a kernel of truth. And I think there's a lot being exaggerated here. And I think like obviously large language models are here to stay. It's not like they're going to like disappear. They clearly are working. But I think that they're, getting to the point that they're really useful is still not totally obvious. And I think there's probably a lot of very real companies that are doing things that are really boring, like making they're like a very simple UX for someone to give them the power of having like 100 interns. They can be like, hey, like, can you research this thing and like do this for me? And there'll be front ends to ChatGPT that become popular. On the other hand, I'm not so sure how many competitors there'll be. Like, it's not clear to me that this current boom is like a thing that you can, from an investor standpoint, invest in startups, because it does feel like the biggest players seem to dominate so much and have so much market power that like, there'll be all these startups building apps on there, and then like, OpenAI will shut you off, or Google will shut you off, or whatever, right? Like, or you rely on a huge cloud bill and you're spending a ton on GPUs. Like, it's not like a cheap game. Like in crypto, the barriers to entry are a lot lower. The barriers to entry in AI are really high, and all the people who I think it's low are building things that are easily replaceable. So from an investor standpoint, I think it's a little like obviously there's going to be this crazy hype cycle, but I kind of don't buy it in the sense that like I buy it for like if you want to go buy Microsoft shares, go do that. Like that makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Or as a proxy for OpenAI. Or if you want to buy Adept, or there are a couple like competitors to OpenAI who are like very worth considering, like Adept. And then there's a couple people doing kind of like decentralized training. So those are more on the like core infrastructure, hard problems type of companies. And those I think will actually, those will do well. But I think a lot of people who are like X.AI and I'm really just a front end, that those are all like get competed away to zero. I know you weren't asking about the investor side, but I think like you kind of have to, in a bubble like this, you kind of
Yeah.
have to think of it that way.
Yes, I think we saw the same like last year. Sorry, I think in 2021 where like a lot of people were buying this governance tokens and like invest like anyone was a VC and they were buying anything which was on their deck, which was on the table. Getting back to crypto, you host a roundup, weekly roundup. So like how like and you have talked about FTX multiple times. Or
Maybe too much. I think we're gonna retire that.
so like what are your aggregated thoughts on FTX? Do you think like right now after like Entropy getting investment from Google and like crypto pumping back again, like do you think like FTX users are gonna get a hold? Like what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have very negative feelings toward Anthropic, but I also that's also because I think AI safety is a LARP by EA people. Like, so there's been a lot of research on AI fairness, and the number one outcome of almost all research on AI fairness is there's no way to make a uniform single definition of fairness that works in all contexts. Right? Think about the different types of questions people ask ChatGPT and the different like sentiments in them. There's sort of a sense in which if you try to write down some mathematical definition of fairness and like enforce it in the model, you will inevitably cause some externality to someone else who makes a query and it gives them the wrong answer. It's like by adding in these fairness constraints, it's actually very, very difficult to do it perfectly. And that's their whole thing is that. And I don't know. I mean, I also just have always had some distrust of effective altruists, so it's very hard to believe that they're the ones who should be choosing what's safe and not. Because clearly that's not true based on a couple empirical events like FTX. Yeah, so I think Anthropic raising is interesting. I mean, I'm kind of curious if the bankruptcy court is going to go after them like immediately. Because that would be very funny. Like imagine they raise the $300 million and 2 seconds later the bankruptcy court is like, actually you have to give us 298 of it. Because SBF owns enough that and has veto on the Series B that it's going to be a very interesting case because the bankruptcy court's not dumb and they're I'm sure this will show up somehow. So anyway, sorry. But your question is the market back?
Oh no, my actual question was like what are aggregated thoughts on FTX? But like as you talked about Entropy, don't you think like the bankruptcy court would auction off the equity?
So the thing is, in private investments, almost always the companies keep a right of refusal. So Anthropic would have to approve any sale. Then it becomes a question of who can they get to get approved to sell to? And it's a very funny thing is Google invested less than what the last round that SBF invested. He invested 500 million. Google is clearly not going to buy enough to cover that sale, right? Like there's something is very interesting. I think Google's calculus is we're going to invest less so that if the bankruptcy court comes after them, they can't come after us and or try to sell to us, dump to us. There's something very funny that Anthropic will be a textbook case study in some business school textbook, I bet, in 10 years. But yeah, I mean, my summary of thoughts are I don't know, people who are assholes are always assholes regardless of what they say publicly. And anyone who tries to get articles written about them saying that they're the most generous donor in history is usually not historically. So I think there's also just this thing of centralized counterparts are bad. And, there's a reason in crypto to avoid them.
Agreed. So like back when I was in the Bahamas, when everything was fine, a lot of EAs were visiting the Bahamas. So like every time they used to talk about robots taking over the world. And
Yeah.
once one EA told me they are gonna take over in the next 5 years. They're gonna kill us. They're gonna abuse us. So EAs have laughed it a lot.
Well,
So
this gets
what's
back to why it's why would I trust them to define what safety is? They don't seem to have very good, they don't seem to understand the research part that shows that's very hard to do. And then B, it's just oh, we're going to choose how to do it. So, okay, so you want to be a dictator? You should just call it that. Call it the EA dictatorship. Don't say AI safety.
So what's happening new in Mave right now?
I've been writing a lot of papers on it. So, proving properties about auctions that you could use for MEV. I think the interesting questions to me that are still very open are how much does MEV change once you have more ZK primitives? Another thing that's actually quite important is, I keep trying to emphasize this on Twitter, but I guess I don't think it's quite landed as much as I hoped, which is Google is getting sued by the DOJ, Department of Justice, for manipulating their auction. And crypto, in a lot of ways, if we get everything right, should actually be able to make auctions that you can't manipulate and like all the accusations against Google couldn't happen in MEV. Like it's like sort of a fair auction. Like anyone can join, anyone can enter, but like you can't really censor them. And so I think like the North Star of MEV should just basically be to like make those auctions and show that crypto is uniquely the only place you can do that. And because of that, then it's like all the auctions that exist on the internet. I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow. Ad auctions are really hard to move to a chain, but you could imagine a world where a lot of the final settlement of big auctions on the internet, like ad auctions, happens in blockchains because blockchains are the only place that's credibly neutral and that you can actually really trust the auction process. And so I think like that's sort of like, at least for me, that's like something that's been really top of mind, is like how do you make the auctions in MEV like fair in a way that takes advantage of a lot of the advantages of crypto being decentralized and also having verifiable computation, such that it's just the best place on the internet possible to do an auction for anything.
What do you think about NFT lending and borrowing?
There's all this like RWA hype of like, hey, we have some real world asset you can borrow against. I think NFTs are basically the same. It's like you have to make some notion of credit quality of your counterpart. And I don't think there's like a particularly good notion of credit quality. And since there's no liquidity, it's really hard to say. I still think things like fractionalization at least give you some of the benefits, and like borrowing against fractions makes sense. But I think it's just like the notion that like there's going to be some like purely algorithmic credit quality solution that's on chain is a bit naive. But hey, look, people are still trying it. So, I mean, what about you? What's your opinion?
Yes, I haven't looked into NFTs much. Like most of the NFT people like I talked to recently are like they say like it's just speculation. Yeah, that's my opinion. What is the most recent research like you're working on?
Yeah, so I had two papers recently. One is actually proving properties of this auction that people made for maybe the most unfortunate NFT in history, because any NFT collection whose creator ends in a sexual abuse trial is not ideal, which is Art Gobblers. But they had an interesting mechanism, and their analysis in the blog post was wrong, or not wrong, but doesn't include. It's not like fully. It doesn't give you the full analysis. But there's an interesting thing is that auction format of the gradual Dutch auction actually can achieve a lot of really good auction property if you modify it slowly. And so that was one thing I did over the holiday, actually when I was in India. The other thing was this concept of credible auctions. So credible auction, there's sort of like, speaking of another trilemma. So economists, even though they've kind of known this forever, it took forever to get a proof of this, but there's sort of a trilemma in auctions that's known, which is there's sort of three properties you might want out of an auction. The first is that it's bidder incentive compatible, which means that people bid what their true value is. They're not trying to guess what everyone else is bidding and then just bidding just above that. They're actually bidding if they really think it's worth 2 times as much as everyone else. They bid 2 times as much. They don't just bid 1.1. The second is seller incentive compatibility. So seller incentive compatibility is the auctioneer has no reason to cheat in an auction. So as an example, a second price auction is something where you have people who bid, and then the person who bids the highest pays what the second place person bid. So maybe the first place bid was $10, the second place bid was $2, then the first place person who bid $10 buys it at $2. And it turns out that's buyer incentive compatible. The problem is it's not seller incentive compatible, because the seller can add a fake bid at $9.99 and then force the person to pay $9.99 instead of $10, right? So there's this idea that like such auctions are not compatible for the seller. So you have buyer incentive compatibility, I bid what I believe. Seller incentive compatibility, the auctioneer doesn't have any reason to add fake bids or pump the price in some indirect way. And then the third is bounded communication complexity. So I don't have to interact with you many times. Like I give you a bid, you tell me, do you want to raise your bid? Then I raise my bid, then we don't have to play this like kind of back and forth game. Turns out you can't get all three. An interesting fact is like the auctions that governments use to sell spectrum are these ones that could take forever, that don't end. There's like many rounds and it's unclear. You can't bound how long. But with crypto, and under some assumptions at least, you can kind of get around this trilemma. In the same way that crypto sort of kind of gets around the trilemmas that people had in distributed systems, there's sort of a way that you can get around it for auctions, and that's what our paper was. And I think like in general, ZK proofs provide a way of like actually increasing the guarantees of these, and so that's something I've been thinking a lot about, because I think if you can really show that like a public blockchain plus a zero knowledge proof is necessary for a very fair auction, then it's very clear that crypto is probably the only place you can actually do fair auction.
Have you read this research paper on Zadkey Bridge?
Yeah, a little bit. I disclosure, I did invest in one, so I am biased by the one that I like. So
So what are your thoughts on Zadkey Bridges?
I think the ZK part is really good for avoiding code mistake, like two pieces of state aren't like exactly synchronized, and for making sure the consensus is correctly updated. I think there's still always a data availability problem and a deployment problem. Like the Nomad Bridge attack, a Nomad Bridge attack was really a DevOps problem, right? It's like I initialized an array to 0 and something expected the array to have non-zero entries. That's the type of thing that like still can impact any of these. Like the deployment issues are still just as large, if not larger. And the data availability side is like, I do need to guarantee that both sides can verify that like both sides had certain data. So like that part it gets much more complicated when you have rollups, because I may need to actually get some of the rollup state in my proof, because like someone sent a fraud proof, and I need the rollup state that proves the fraud proof worked correctly before my bridge can like handle the rollback. So this stuff is not solved. So I will put out this disclaimer for that. But I will say, I think a lot of the issues people have had on correctness, and also issues people have had with these like supply chain attacks, Haxies, multi-sig, stuff like that, I think a lot of those become much ameliorated in ZK. But I don't think there's like a notion of a perfect bridge for what it's worth. But I do think the ZK aspect allows you to not shoot yourself in the foot a lot.
So you're also investors. Like, what is the current sentiment in the investor space?
I think if I were to be honest, I think it's like probably kind of negative for the really big investors, because like they either bought a bunch of liquid crypto that's down, or they invested in things that went to 0, or they are kind of like, the problem is there's not that many investments that need a lot of money. For the early stage seed stuff, it's great, because things that are new are much easier to invest in, if that makes sense. Like they're easier to invest in from the standpoint of there's just less risk, in the sense that like, okay, fine, a bunch fail, at least as long as a couple work, it's good. But there's also just a sense in which that's where people are trying ideas that haven't been tried, versus like investing in these growth stage things. There's not really that many of those that are investable right now, especially post, the largest growth stage investment in this industry went to 0 in FTX. So it's like very kind of a little hard to and Genesis, like between the two of those, it's like kind of hard to justify that. But I think on the earliest stages a lot, and I think the big funds still miss stuff all the time, not of their own volition. I think they're just like either too risk averse, or they're their systems are kind of slow. So I think like on the small, if you're just starting, great time. Always like in fact, I actually think the best time to start something new is in a bear market. When I started Gauntlet, it was a bear market, and I gotta say, it gives you a lot of discipline. You're not like chasing hype. You're just like, okay, I raised this much money. Here's what I want to do. I've committed to doing this one thing. I'm not really going to try to do 500 things, and that's it. Whereas I think in these like high capital intensity times, you might raise a lot of money, and then you're like, okay, I got to go do 500 things. Because I think like for a startup, sometimes you just need to like focus on one or two things, do them really well. Even if you don't do them that well, at least you gave the effort of focusing on one of them, versus like, okay, I started with an AMM. Okay, we didn't get any adoption. Let me like add in a lending protocol. Okay, let me add in an NFT protocol. Let me, like it's very, very rare when you can Frankenstein your way into a product that works, right? Like people are always like, oh, but like WeChat and WhatsApp did it. And it's like, no, they didn't. They really started with one thing really well, which was chat, before they did any of the other stuff. And I kind of think like people in crypto, because they have low attention spans, maybe due to Twitter, they like want to just keep you give them money, they'll like try to do 500 things. And like the good part about a bear market is you can't do that, even if you want to.
So what are some legal stimulant for math nerds?
Well, you have my legal stimulant of choice.
Yes.
But I saw some like Ethereum developer today who had this funny tweet about doing modafinil for the first time, which is like, I mean, it's legal if you have a prescription. But like, a sugar-free Red Bull, I'm always a fan. Maybe I drink too many, but honestly, it's not even that much caffeine. Because like an 8-ounce Red Bull is like less than a cup of coffee. And so it's like, it's not that crazy. But yeah, I definitely am a Red Bull fan. I'm hoping one day Red Bull discovers I exist and just sponsors all my consumption. I would love for them to just like ship me cases.
I used to drink those like back in the Bahamas. Like there was like all these like little crates which they used to bring, like Red Bull, then Celsius, and like all these like drinks.
Got to be
Uh,
some irony that they use Celsius money to buy Celsius.
yeah, that was a good joke. From joke, like, do you have any good math joke for me so that I can crack it next time I meet a math nerd?
There used to be this one that people always said in grad school, which is, what's the difference between a mathematician and a pizza?
Mathematician and the pizza.
Only one can feed a family of 4.
Wait,
Yeah,
I
people used to say that all the time. I like, even like the professors would say that, and I would always be like, I'm surprised you're a tenured professor. It's not true for you.
what is one of the funniest incidents you had?
I
Maybe in
walk
crypto.
I walk around the world with like green hair. Like people always are randomly stopping me on the street. I don't know. Actually,
Uh,
one incident that was kind of funny is I went to India and I wear a lot of colors and I like have color hair, and this like homeless guy, he like was like following me at night and was like, "Yo, are you colorblind?" And he just kept saying that forever, and I thought that was hilarious.
wait,
I
which glasses were you wearing?
same glasses, but I just
Oh.
like had a lot of other colors, and like but it was like hilarious. He's like, you're wearing so many colors that you must be colorblind. That's the only way that you could.
Do you have a origin story for your hair?
I've gone to the same stylist for 12 years, and she one day was like, "Have you ever thought about coloring your hair?" I was like, "No, but I would love to troll everyone I work with." And then she's like, "Okay, how would you like to do it?" And I did, and then after that, I just never turned back. It was very not that. It was more that like I was trying to make fun of my coworkers for being very like by the book, but
Cool, awesome. What advice would you give to someone who is interested in the research in math?
I think if you're like interested in pure math, then like obviously academia is like the only way. But I think if you're interested in like how math impacts society and like can be used in other ways, I definitely think like crypto and the ZK side has a ton of stuff where it's like you can make pure math useful in reality. I think AI a little bit, but there's not that much that's like that deep there. Whereas I actually think a lot of the math in ZK land is extremely deep. The thing I'm still searching for that hasn't happened, and what the field I worked in was like sort of associated with string theory and physics. And the interesting thing was like mathematicians would prove something, and then physicists would find something, and then mathematicians would prove something, and physicists would find something, and they like had this synergistic flywheel loop. And I think that hasn't happened yet in ZK land, but I bet you that will happen in the sense that like mathematicians have proved all this shit and cryptographers are just consumers. They don't actually produce any new math. But there's likely some problems they will run into where they will have produced new math, and that's like will cause a feedback loop. But I think we're still at the early days.
So, just to clarify, string theory is the same thing what Sheldon Cooper was doing in Big Bang Theory.
Yes, he did make it look very bad, but yes.
Any advice for bear market survivors?
Focus on one thing. No, seriously, like honestly, if you try, even if you fail at the one thing, you will have learned a lot more than if you try to flip to chase the wind, if that makes sense. Even when it feels like, oh, everyone else is flipping, there's a lot to gain from like being established as like doing one thing and people know that you're working on one thing.
Gotcha. What are some productivity tips you would like to share?
Sugar-free Red Bull. No, seriously. I really, if I don't have Red Bull one day, I'm like, cannot write at all. The only one that ever really changed my life was getting an iPad. and not writing notes on paper and then losing notebooks, which is a very low bar. But like I still like handwriting things, and but like moving to an iPad meant I never lost anything, which is a very boring productivity hack. So
What are some of the life lessons you would like to share?
Don't listen to people who tell you like something seems too, like that two very distant fields might be related. I mean, there might be something interesting, just will take time. Silicon Valley thought leader people, and I hate San Francisco, so maybe this is why I'm sort of making fun of them. We'll always say like, oh yeah, like I need like all this time to do slow work. But like the irony is none of those people ever actually do slow work because they like constantly flip their focus. I think sometimes like actual slow work of like focusing on one thing and spending a lot of time really understanding it, and especially when it's something where a lot of people don't believe it's, they're like, oh, I don't know if that could be true, and really having a lot of conviction in that is like sometimes super, you might find things that you don't expect there, even though the rest of the world may not see it yet.
The final question, what is some of the alpha you would like to share?
Yeah, the real question to me is like the next bull market will be triggered by whenever there's something that's a ZK thing that makes revenue, that has a token that the revenue is tied to. That's a bet. It's not really alpha as much as like, I think, if Starkware actually generates revenue on day one, like Starkware will be a good buy. But I think early on it might be hard. I think the hardware people working on hardware provers like Ulvatana, Jump, etc. I think like once the hardware provers can actually profitably make money, I think that's when the ZK coins become valuable.
Gotcha. Interesting.
It's not exactly like alpha, like you can trade it tomorrow. So I'm sorry. It's more like VC-ish alpha of like how to think about valuing ZK stuff.
So buying ZK coins is the alpha.
I'm saying if Starkware's launch goes well, you should be buying ZK coins.
Cool, awesome. Yes, thanks for joining, Tarun. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah.